A millionaire humiliates a black nurse in front of everyone, but after a minute, something happens that changes everything. Subscribe, watch more videos, and comment where you're watching from. The emergency room of St. Mary's Hospital was alive with chaos. The muted hum of fluorescent lights mixed with the hurried shuffle of nurses and the low murmur of patients waiting in the crowded reception area. A clock on the wall ticked steadily, indifferent to the anxiety that filled the air. Each second dragged as patients waited for their names to be called, clutching paper forms or quietly consoling loved ones. Then the doors swung open with a forceful bang. Heads turned as a tall, imposing figure entered, carrying a young girl in his arms. His tailored suit was slightly rumpled, his hair disheveled, a rare sight for the pristine image of Aaron Blake, a man whose name was synonymous with wealth and power. He moved quickly, his polished leather shoes clicking against the tile floor. The child in his arms, Cassidy, appeared pale and fragile, her breathing shallow. "I need a doctor right now." Aaron's voice cut through the din like a knife, sharp and commanding. People in the waiting area turned to stare, their conversations ceasing mid-sentence. The reception nurse glanced up, startled by the sheer force of his tone. "Sir," she began, her tone cautious but professional, "please take a seat and fill out the forms. A nurse will—" "I don't have time for forms," Aaron barked, his voice rising. "This is my daughter, and she needs help immediately. Don't you understand the meaning of the word emergency?" The nurse flushed, clearly flustered. "I understand, sir, but we have procedures. There are other patients." "I don't care about your procedures or your patients," Aaron interrupted, his voice thunderous. "Do you know who I am? I can have this entire hospital shut down if I don't get the help I'm demanding right now." The receptionist blinked, taken aback by his audacity. A young mother sitting nearby pulled her child closer, murmuring something under her breath. A tense silence spread through the room, broken only by the faint beep of medical equipment in the distance. It was then that Amara Jones stepped forward. She had been observing the scene from the corner of the room, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Amara was no stranger to difficult patients or overbearing family members, but Aaron Blake's arrogance was something else entirely. Standing at 5'7", with dark brown skin and an air of quiet authority, she approached him with a steady gaze. "Mr. Blake," she said calmly, addressing him by name even though he hadn't introduced himself. His reputation preceded him. "I'm Nurse Jones, and I'll be assisting you tonight. Please follow me." Aaron's jaw tightened. "Finally, someone who knows how to take charge," he muttered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He followed her through the double doors, his stride long and purposeful. Cassidy's head rested limply against his chest, her tiny frame dwarfed by his arms. Amara led him to a treatment room and gestured for him to place Cassidy on the bed. "We'll need a doctor to assess her condition," she said, her voice even. "In the meantime, I need to ask you some questions." Aaron bristled. "Questions? Shouldn't you be doing something useful? Checking her vitals, starting an IV, whatever it is you people do?" Amara didn't flinch. She had dealt with his type before. People who equated money with power, who believed that their wealth made them superior. But she refused to let his attitude affect her professionalism. "Mr. Blake," she said firmly, meeting his gaze, "we're doing everything we can to help your daughter. The questions are necessary to ensure she gets the right treatment. Now, can you tell me what happened?" Aaron exhaled sharply, clearly irritated. "She has a severe peanut allergy," he said. "She accidentally ate something at a friend's house." Her breathing started to get worse, so I brought her here. Isn't that enough information?" Amara nodded, jotting down notes on her clipboard. "Thank you. Has she received an epinephrine injection?" "Yes," Aaron replied. "I gave her one from her EpiPen before we left the house, but it didn't seem to help much." "All right," Amara said. "I'll notify the doctor immediately. In the meantime, we'll monitor her vitals." She turned to leave, but Aaron wasn't done. "You'd better notify the best doctor you have," he called after her, "and don't think I won't hold you accountable if anything goes wrong." Amara paused in the doorway, her grip tightening on the clipboard. She could feel the heat of his glare on her back, but she refused to let it get to her. Without turning around, she replied, "We take every case seriously, Mr. Blake. Your daughter is in good hands." As she walked away, Aaron muttered something under his breath, the words too low to hear but unmistakably bitter. The next half hour passed in a tense blur. Cassidy was placed under observation, and a doctor was called to assess her condition. Aaron paced the room, his impatience mounting with every passing minute. He checked his watch repeatedly, muttering about the inefficiency of the hospital staff. Amara returned with a tray of supplies, preparing to take Cassidy's vitals. Aaron's eyes narrowed as she approached. "Took you long enough," he snapped. Amara ignored his comment and began her work. Cassidy stirred slightly, her breathing still shallow but steady. Amara leaned down, her tone soft and reassuring. "Hi, Cassidy. I'm Nurse Amara. We're going to take good care of you, all right?" Cassidy blinked up at her eyes glassy but trusting. Aaron, however, remained unimpressed. "Isn't there someone else who can do this?" he demanded. "Someone more qualified?" Amara straightened, her expression neutral. "I am fully qualified, Mr. Blake. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to focus on your daughter." The tension in the room was palpable. Aaron crossed his arms, his jaw set in a hard line, but he didn't say anything further. As Amara worked, she couldn't help but notice the way Aaron hovered over Cassidy, his stern demeanor softening whenever he looked at her. Despite his arrogance, it was clear that he loved his daughter deeply. It was a reminder, however faint, that even the most difficult people had their vulnerable sides. But the moment of quiet observation was short-lived. Just as Amara finished her assessment, Aaron's frustration boiled over. "This is taking too long," he snapped. "I'll make a few calls and have someone else take over." Before Amara could respond, Aaron took a step forward, his face flushed with anger, and then he froze. His hand went to his chest, his expression twisting in pain. For a moment, he seemed to teeter on the edge of consciousness. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, he collapsed to the floor. Amara reacted instantly, dropping to her knees beside him. "Call a code," she shouted to a nearby nurse. Her hands moved with a practiced precision, checking his pulse and airway. The staff sprang into action, the room filling with the urgency of a medical emergency. As they worked to stabilize Aaron, Cassidy's faint voice broke through the commotion. "Is Daddy going to be okay?" Amara glanced up, her expression softening. "We're doing everything we can," she said gently. For the first time, the man who had always commanded attention and control found himself utterly powerless. And as Amara fought to save his life, she couldn't help but wonder if this moment would change him, or if he would remain the man who had stormed into the hospital, believing he was untouchable. The sterile hum of the monitors filled the small treatment room as Aaron Blake lay motionless on the hospital bed. Amara Jones stood at his side, her hands steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across Aaron's pale face accentuating the beads of sweat on his forehead and the tension in his jaw. "Pulse is weak but steady," she said aloud, her voice calm but firm as she called out updates to the medical team. "Respiration shallow. We need oxygen and a cardiac monitor set up now." The team worked quickly around her, the controlled chaos of an emergency in full swing. Amara barely noticed the sharp ache in her knees from kneeling by Aaron's side or the nervous glances from the junior nurse assisting her. All that mattered was stabilizing the man in front of her, even if he had spent the past hour belittling and demeaning her. Cassidy, Aaron's daughter, stood just outside the doorway, clutching the frame with trembling hands. Her tear-streaked face betrayed her fear, but her wide eyes stayed fixed on her father. "Daddy," she whispered. Amara looked up briefly. "We're helping him, sweetheart, but I need you to step back and let us do our job, okay?" Cassidy hesitated but nodded. A volunteer stepped forward to guide her away, but the girl resisted. "Don't let him die," she said, her voice breaking. Amara's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay focused. "I won't," she promised. The words came out sharper than intended, but they steadied her resolve. No matter how cruel Aaron Blake had been, no matter how much her pride burned from his insults, she wouldn't let him die. Not here, not now. Aaron stirred, his eyelids fluttering as consciousness began to return. His body felt heavy, his chest tight. Sounds blurred in his ears, voices, machines, the rhythmic beep of monitors. Slowly, his vision cleared, and the first thing he saw was Amara leaning over him, her face etched with concentration. "Mr. Blake," she said, noticing his movement, "can you hear me?" His throat was dry, and it took effort to form words. "What happened?" "You collapsed," Amara replied, her voice professional but firm. "You had a cardiac event, possibly stress-induced. We stabilized you, but we're monitoring your vitals closely." Aaron tried to sit up, but Amara pressed a hand to his shoulder. "Don't move too quickly. You need to rest." "I can't." His voice cracked and his eyes darted around the room. "Cassidy?" "She's fine," Amara reassured him, "but she's worried about you. I'll let her in to see you soon, but right now, I need you to stay calm." For the first time, Aaron's expression softened, the sheer vulnerability of the moment cutting through his usual bravado. He swallowed hard, then looked at Amara as if seeing her for the first time. "You saved me," he said, the words foreign and heavy on his tongue. Amara didn't flinch under his gaze. "It's my job," she said simply, turning to check the monitor beside him. But Aaron didn't let the conversation drop. "After what I said to you—" "You needed help," Amara interrupted, her tone neutral. "That's all that matters." Cassidy entered the room a few minutes later, her small frame trembling as she rushed to her father's side. "Daddy!" Her voice cracked as she gripped his hand. Aaron squeezed her fingers weakly, his voice hoarse. "I'm okay, sweetheart." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "I was so scared." "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry." Amara stood back, giving them a moment, but her mind raced. Despite Aaron's temporary vulnerability, she knew men like him didn't change overnight. She expected his arrogance to resurface once he recovered, and yet something about the way he held his daughter suggested cracks in his carefully crafted armor. Cassidy turned toward Amara suddenly. "You saved him, didn't you?" Amara hesitated. "I just did my job." "But you didn't have to," Cassidy said quietly, her voice laced with gratitude that made Amara's chest tighten. Aaron shifted uncomfortably. "Cass, don't." "No," Cassidy interrupted. "You were awful to her, Dad. I heard what you said." She turned to Amara. "I'm sorry for how he acted." Amara blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected an apology, especially not from the daughter of a man like Aaron Blake. "Thank you," Amara said softly. Cassidy looked at her father expectantly, but Aaron remained silent, his jaw tight. Amara didn't push. She had seen plenty of men like him in her career, proud, stubborn, and terrified of showing weakness. If he couldn't bring himself to apologize, that was his burden to carry. The rest of the night passed in fits and starts. Aaron drifted in and out of sleep, and Amara checked his vitals regularly. Each time she found Cassidy sitting by his side, refusing to leave. The girl's loyalty was undeniable, and Amara couldn't help but admire it, even if her father didn't seem to deserve it. In the early hours of the morning, Aaron woke to find Amara adjusting his IV. "You're still here?" he asked, his voice groggy. "It's my shift," Amara replied without looking at him. He paused, then added, "I appreciate it." Amara finally met his eyes. For a moment, she thought she saw genuine sincerity there. "I told you before," she said, "it's my job." But as she turned away, Aaron spoke again. "No," he said quietly, "it's more than that." By the time the sun rose, the storm of the previous night had settled into an uneasy calm. Aaron's condition had stabilized, but the weight of his near-death experience lingered heavily in the room. Cassidy had fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, and Aaron sat watching her, his expression unusually soft. Amara entered to check on him one last time before the end of her shift. "She really loves you," she said quietly, nodding toward Cassidy. Aaron's eyes didn't leave his daughter. "She's all I have," he admitted. "Then don't waste it," Amara said, her voice gentle but firm. Aaron looked up, and for the first time there was no condescension in his gaze, only something raw and uncertain. As Amara left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had shifted something fundamental. Whether Aaron Blake could truly change remained to be seen, but one thing was clear. The storm that had brought him into the hospital had only just begun. The light filtering through the hospital room's blinds was muted, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls. Aaron Blake sat propped up in bed, his shoulders hunched as he stared at the pale blue blanket draped over his legs. His breathing was steady now, the tightness in his chest finally eased by the medication coursing through his veins. Cassidy slept in the chair beside him, her small body curled into a ball, clutching a hospital blanket that Amara had brought earlier. The soft rise and fall of her breath filled the silence, a gentle rhythm that Aaron clung to in the stillness of the morning. But even as his daughter slept peacefully, Aaron's thoughts were far from calm. He replayed the events of the previous night over and over. The panic in Cassidy's voice, the sharp pain in his chest, the unbearable weight of helplessness that had brought him to his knees. And then there was Amara. The image of her kneeling beside him, steady hands working swiftly to save his life, refused to leave his mind. The shame gnawed at him. For years, Aaron Blake had prided himself on control. He built his empire from nothing, outmaneuvering competitors and crushing anyone who stood in his way. Weakness was not an option. Dependence on others was unthinkable. And yet, there he was, alive only because a woman he had ridiculed and demeaned had chosen to help him anyway. He glanced at Cassidy and felt the familiar sting of regret. He had failed her, too. The one person who depended on him more than anyone else in the world had watched him collapse, helpless and afraid. A sharp knock on the door snapped him from his thoughts. Amara entered, her presence commanding yet calm, carrying a clipboard in one hand. Her uniform was crisp, and despite the exhaustion etched into her features, She moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to crisis. Aaron tensed instinctively, but Amara's expression was neutral as she crossed the room. "Good mornin', Mr. Blake," she said, her voice even. "Mornin'," he replied, his tone clipped but lacking the hostility of the night before. Amara's gaze flicked to Cassidy. "She's been here all night?" Aaron nodded. "I couldn't convince her to go home." A faint smile tugged at Amara's lips. "She's a fighter," she said softly, and for a moment Aaron thought he detected admiration in her voice. "She gets it from her mother," he said before he could stop himself. The words hung in the air, heavier than he'd intended. Amara's eyes shifted back to him, her expression unreadable. "How are you feeling?" Aaron hesitated. "Better," he admitted, though the word felt foreign. "Good," Amara said, scanning the monitor beside his bed. "Your vitals have stabilized, but we're going to keep you under observation for at least another 24 hours. Aaron opened his mouth to protest, but stopped when Amara shot him a pointed look. "Don't argue," she said. "I'm not in the mood." For once, Aaron didn't argue. Instead, he watched as Amara methodically checked the IV line and adjusted the monitors. Her movements were efficient, but there was a gentleness to the way she handled the equipment. It was the same gentleness she'd shown Cassidy the night before, and it unsettled him more than he cared to admit. "Why did you do it?" he asked suddenly. Amara paused, her hand hovering over the monitor before she turned to face him. "Do what?" "Save me," Aaron said. The words hung heavy in the room. Amara's expression didn't change. "Because it's my job," she said simply. "That's not an answer," Aaron pressed, his voice low. "You could have let me die, and no one would have blamed you after the way I treated you." Amara's eyes softened, but her voice remained firm. "I became a nurse to save lives, Mr. Blake, not to judge who deserves it." Aaron swallowed hard, her words hitting him harder than he expected. He opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when Cassidy stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open. "Daddy?" Aaron shifted his focus, brushing her hair back from her face. "I'm here, sweetheart." Cassidy sat up, her gaze flicking nervously between Aaron and Amara. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Aaron reassured her, forcing a smile. Cassidy turned to Amara. "You saved him, didn't you?" Aaron tensed, but Amara crouched down to Cassidy's level, offering a warm smile. "Your dad's pretty strong, but he just needed a little help." Cassidy blinked up at her. "Thank you," she whispered. Amara reached out, gently squeezing the girl's hand. "You're welcome." Aaron watched the exchange in silence, the knot in his chest tightening. He hated the way it made him feel. Vulnerable, exposed, and yet he couldn't look away. When Amara straightened and moved toward the door, Aaron found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "Wait." Amara paused, glancing back. Aaron faltered, the words catching in his throat. He cleared it, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry for everything I said to you." Amara didn't react right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he expected. "Thank you." Then she was gone, leaving Aaron alone with his daughter and the uncomfortable weight of his apology. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Aaron's body grew stronger, but his mind felt heavier with each passing hour. He thought about the look in Amara's eyes when he apologized. Steady, guarded, yet not entirely closed off. Later that evening, after Cassidy had fallen asleep again, Aaron asked one of the nurses about Amara. "She's one of the best we've got," the nurse said. "Been here for years. Single mom, too. Raises her son by herself, and still works double shifts most weeks. Aaron frowned. What happened to her son's father? The nurse shrugged. Died a few years ago. Cancer, I think. She doesn't talk about it much. Aaron's stomach tightened. For the first time, he saw Amara not just as the nurse who had saved his life, but as a person who had endured more than most and still found the strength to keep going. That night, as he lay in bed listening to the rhythmic beep of the monitors, Aaron Blake made a decision. He didn't know how, but he was going to make things right. The hospital room was steeped in an eerie quiet as the evening crept in, broken only by the faint hum of monitors and the occasional shuffle of nurses outside the door. Aaron Blake sat on the edge of his bed, the hospital-issued blanket bunched around his waist, his eyes fixed on the sleeping figure of his daughter. Cassidy's chest rose and fell steadily, her breathing soft and even. The earlier scare that had brought them to this place still lingered in his mind, but seeing her now, calm, safe, gave him a temporary sense of relief. Temporary, because the weight of the last 24 hours pressed down on him like an anchor. His body felt foreign, betrayed by the sudden collapse that had left him vulnerable in ways he never imagined. The man who built an empire on unyielding strength had been reduced to a patient, dependent on a woman he had treated with nothing but disdain. And yet, the image of Amara's steady hands and unwavering gaze stayed with him, cutting through his carefully maintained arrogance. Aaron ran a hand down his face, exhaustion heavy in his bones, when the door opened. Amara stepped inside, clipboard in hand. She moved with her usual poise, her expression neutral as she approached the monitors to check his vitals. "You're still here," Aaron said, breaking the silence. Amara didn't look up. "Night shift," she replied, her voice professional but not unkind. Aaron nodded, though the conversation stalled as he struggled to find the right words. He wanted to thank her again, properly this time, but the thought of exposing even more vulnerability left him frozen. Before he could gather his thoughts, Cassidy stirred. "Daddy?" Aaron turned to her, his features softening. "I'm here, sweetheart." Cassidy sat up slowly, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Are you feeling better?" "I am," he said, forcing a reassuring smile. "Thanks to Nurse Amara." Cassidy looked past him, her gaze landing on Amara. "You're still here too?" Amara smiled. "I told you I'd be nearby if you needed me." Cassidy nodded, but then her small face twisted in discomfort. She clutched at her stomach, her brows furrowing. "Cass?" Aaron's voice sharpened. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," she whimpered. "It hurts." Aaron's pulse quickened. He turned to Amara, panic flashing in his eyes. She was fine. Amara was already moving, pressing a hand gently to Cassidy's forehead. "She's running a fever," she said, her voice calm but clipped. "We need to get her checked now." Cassidy's whimper turned into a cry, her face paling as she doubled over in pain. Aaron stood abruptly, ignoring the way his body protested the sudden movement. "Do something!" "I need you to step back, Mr. Blake." Amara's voice cut through his panic like a blade, firm but not unkind. "I'll take care of her, but you need to let me work." Aaron clenched his fists, his instinct to protect his daughter warring with his sudden helplessness. But one look at Amara's steady hands as she prepared the IV calmed him just enough to step aside. Minutes felt like hours as Cassidy was wheeled into a new room for testing. Aaron followed closely, his heart pounding in his chest. He hovered near the doorway, watching as doctors and nurses moved quickly, issuing orders he didn't fully understand. Amara remained at the center of it all. She worked with precision and confidence, instructing the junior staff and ensuring Cassidy was stabilized. Aaron paced the hall, his thoughts spiraling. "What's happening to her?" he demanded as Amara stepped out of the room. "We're still running tests, but it could be a secondary allergic reaction or an infection," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "We need to keep her under observation." Aaron's frustration boiled over. "That's not good enough. I need answers." Amara didn't flinch. "I understand you're scared, but shouting at me isn't going to help your daughter." Her words hit him like a slap. He faltered, the fight draining out of him as fear took over. "I can't lose her," he admitted, his voice breaking. "You won't," Amara said softly, "but I need you to trust me." Aaron met her eyes, and for the first time, he did. Hours passed in a blur of medical tests and procedures. Aaron stayed by Cassidy's side, holding her hand and murmuring reassurances as she drifted in and out of sleep. Amara was a constant presence, checking monitors, adjusting medication, and coordinating with the doctors. At one point, Aaron caught her wiping at her eyes when she thought no one was looking. The sight unsettled him. For all her professionalism, it was clear the situation was affecting her, too. Later that night, as Cassidy finally stabilized, Aaron found Amara sitting in a corner of the room, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "You haven't stopped all night," he said quietly, approaching her. Amara straightened. "It's part of the job." Aaron hesitated before sitting beside her. "Why'd you do it?" he asked. Amara blinked, clearly surprised by the question. "Because it matters." Aaron looked at her closely. "There's more to it than that." She hesitated, then sighed. "Because I know what it's like to feel helpless, to watch someone you love fight for their life and not be able to do anything." Aaron's throat tightened. "Your son?" Amara nodded. "He had leukemia. We fought it for 2 years, but—" Her voice trailed off, and Aaron saw the flicker of pain in her eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Amara shrugged. "That's why I'm here, to make sure no one else has to go through that alone." Aaron didn't know how to respond. For once, words failed him. Cassidy woke the next morning looking stronger, her fever gone and her breathing steady. Amara entered with a warm smile. "How's my favorite patient?" Cassidy grinned sleepily. "Better." Aaron stood, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice raw but sincere. Amara met his gaze. "It's what I do." But this time Aaron knew it was so much more than that. As the day unfolded, Aaron found himself unable to shake the realization that Amara had not only saved his daughter's life, but had also forced him to confront his own weaknesses. For the first time, he saw his wealth and power for what they were. Tools, not shields. And for the first time, he knew he had to use them differently. Aaron Blake sat in the quiet of Cassidy's hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors now oddly comforting. His daughter was finally resting peacefully after the previous night's scare, her color returning and her breathing steady. Yet, despite the calm that had settled over the room, Aaron couldn't quiet the storm inside himself. He looked at her small hand resting in his and felt the crushing weight of guilt pressing down on his chest. Cassidy had nearly died, twice, and both times he'd been powerless to help her. Worse, the person who had saved them was the woman he'd treated with nothing but contempt. Amara Jones. Her name lingered in his mind, along with the steady confidence in her voice as she fought to keep Cassidy alive. She had been unshakable when he had fallen apart, focused when he had let fear take over. And even after everything he'd said to her, she had still saved him without hesitation. Aaron let out a slow breath and leaned back in the chair. He couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He had been wrong. Not just about Amara, but about everything. About the way he viewed people. About the way he used his power to intimidate and control. And now, for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar curling in his chest. Shame. He glanced towards the door, half expecting to see Amara walking in with her clipboard, her steady presence grounding the chaos around her. But this time, she wasn't there. Instead, the door opened to reveal Dr. Patel, Cassidy's physician, stepping in with a clipboard of her own. Aaron sat up straighter. "How is she?" he asked immediately. Dr. Patel smiled reassuringly. "She's stable and responding well to treatment. We'll keep her under observation for another night, but if everything continues to improve, she can go home tomorrow." Aaron exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by another wave of guilt. "Thank you," he said, but even as he spoke, his thoughts drifted back to Amara. Later that day, Aaron stepped out of Cassidy's room for the first time in hours. He needed to clear his head. The hospital hallways bustled with activity. Doctors, nurses, and patients moving in a steady rhythm that reminded him of the world outside his own turmoil. He found himself heading toward the nurses' station, where he spotted Amara standing behind the counter, flipping through a stack of patient files. She looked exhausted, dark circles shadowing her eyes, but her posture remained straight, her focus unbroken. Aaron hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave to avoid another confrontation, but another part, the part that had been cracked open over the past 2 days, refused to walk away. He cleared his throat. Amara looked up, her eyes briefly widening before settling into guarded professionalism. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice measured. "How's Cassidy?" "She's better," Aaron said. "Thanks to you." Amara nodded but didn't say anything. Aaron shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how unprepared he was for this conversation. I wanted to apologize," he began, "for the way I treated you when we first came in." Amara raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Aaron swallowed. "Yes, I was wrong, about you, about how I handled everything." She didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched between them until Aaron felt the urge to fill it. "You saved my daughter," he continued, his voice quieter. "And you saved me. Twice. I don't know how to thank you for that." Amara's expression softened slightly, though she remained guarded. "You don't need to thank me, Mr. Blake. I was just doing my job." Aaron shook his head. "No, it's more than that." He hesitated before stepping closer. "You could have let me suffer. After the way I treated you, no one would have blamed you if you'd walked away. But you didn't, and that says more about you than I can ever put into words." Amara's gaze didn't waver. "I became a nurse to help people, no matter who they are or how they treat me, but that doesn't mean what you said didn't hurt." Aaron flinched at her honesty, but he nodded. "I know, and I'm sorry for that, too." Amara studied him for a moment before finally relaxing her shoulders. "Apology accepted," she said. Relief flooded through Aaron, but it was quickly overshadowed by something else. Determination. "There's something else I need to say," he added. "I can't just apologize and move on. I need to do something to make this right." Amara frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Aaron took a deep breath. "I want to start a foundation for kids like Cassidy who need better access to health care, and for people like you, nurses who work themselves to exhaustion and still don't get the support they deserve." Amara blinked, clearly caught off guard. "You want to start a foundation?" "Yes." Aaron's voice grew stronger. "I have the resources to make a difference, But I need someone to help me do it right. Someone who understands what families and patients actually need." Amara crossed her arms, studying him carefully. "And you think that's me?" Aaron met her gaze. "I know it is." The room fell silent, and Aaron braced himself for her answer. Amara didn't give him an immediate response. Over the next few days, Aaron visited Cassidy and spent time talking to Amara between her shifts. Their conversations shifted from strained politeness to genuine discussions about health care, funding, and the struggles Amara faced as a single mother and a nurse. Aaron began to see the hospital through her eyes. The overcrowded waiting rooms, the understaffed night shifts, the outdated equipment that forced doctors to make impossible choices. And Amara began to see something in Aaron, too. Behind the arrogance and sharp words, there was a man who loved his daughter fiercely and who was, for the first time, confronting his flaws. By the end of the week, Amara agreed to help Aaron with the foundation. It started with late-night meetings at the hospital, sketching out ideas and budgets. Aaron leaned on her expertise, and Amara leaned on his resources, and slowly a partnership began to form. But it wasn't just professional. Late one evening, as they reviewed plans for the foundation, Aaron looked at Amara and said softly, "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I mean what I say." Amara's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then don't let me down." The conference room at St. Mary's Hospital buzzed with nervous energy. Rows of chairs lined the space filled with hospital staff, community members, and reporters clutching notepads and microphones. A makeshift podium stood at the front of the room, flanked by banners bearing the hospital's logo. The air felt charged with anticipation. Aaron Blake stood near the back of the room, adjusting the cuffs of his freshly pressed suit. He had worn darker colors today, subdued navy instead of his usual sharp black, and there was no tie around his neck. The image of control and dominance he had so carefully curated over the years had been softened, though his posture still carried the authority of a man used to commanding attention. But this time, he wasn't commanding anything. He was waiting. Amara Jones stood by the podium reviewing her notes for what felt like the 100th time. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the edges of the paper. Public speaking wasn't something she had ever imagined doing, especially not in front of cameras, but Aaron had insisted. "You're the heart of this," he told her the night before as they finalized the presentation. "This isn't just my story. It's yours, too." Now, as she glanced up at the growing crowd, her nerves threatened to overtake her resolve. She spotted Aaron in the back, his eyes locked on her, and for a fleeting moment, she felt steadier. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind. From late-night planning sessions to meetings with attorneys and hospital administrators, the foundation had taken shape faster than either of them had expected. What had started as an apology had grown into something far bigger, an initiative to provide better access to health care for underprivileged children and support for overworked medical staff. Aaron's influence had opened doors, but Amara's insight had given the project substance. Together, they had crafted a vision that felt both ambitious and deeply personal. But standing here now about to make that vision public, Amara couldn't help but wonder if it was enough. The murmurs died down as the hospital administrator stepped to the podium, clearing her throat before addressing the audience. "Thank you all for being here today," she began. "We're gathered for a very special announcement, one that has the potential to change countless lives in our community." She paused, gesturing toward Aaron and Amara. This initiative would not have been possible without the generosity and vision of Aaron Blake and the dedication of Nurse Amara Jones. Today, we're proud to introduce the Blake Jones Foundation for Pediatric Health and Medical Equity. Applause erupted. Amara blinked, momentarily overwhelmed by the sound. She hadn't expected such an enthusiastic reaction. Aaron stepped forward first, taking his place behind the podium. His usual confidence seemed tempered as he looked out over the crowd. "Most of you know me as a businessman," he began, "and until recently, that's all I thought I was. But a few weeks ago, my daughter was admitted to this hospital, and my world changed." His voice caught briefly, and he glanced toward Cassidy, who sat in the front row beaming up at him. "I was forced to confront my own weaknesses, my own failures. And I was reminded of something I had lost sight of, how fragile life is, and how much we depend on the people who dedicate their lives to saving it." He looked at Amara, and she felt the weight of his words. "I'm standing here today because of one of those people. Nurse Jones didn't just save my daughter. She saved me too. And in the process, she showed me what it truly means to care." The room was silent now, all eyes fixed on him. I realized I couldn't keep living my life the way I had been, focused only on profits and power, so I made a decision. This foundation is my way of giving back, of making sure no parent has to feel the fear I felt that night. He paused, then stepped back, gesturing for Amara to join him. Amara's hands trembled slightly as she approached the microphone, but the look Aaron gave her, steady, reassuring, gave her the push she needed. "When Mr. Blake first approached me about this idea, I wasn't sure what to think," she admitted. "I'd spent my career fighting to make sure patients got the care they needed, but I'd also seen how often the system let them down." She glanced at Aaron. "I didn't expect someone like him to care about fixing that. But over the past few weeks, I've seen how serious he is about making a difference. And I've learned that sometimes change comes from the most unexpected places." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke. "This foundation isn't just about providing resources. It's about leveling the playing field. It's about making sure that every child, no matter where they come from, has access to the care they deserve." She looked at Cassidy, then back at Aaron. "And it's about proving that we're stronger when we work together." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Amara felt tears prick the corners of her eyes as she stepped back from the podium. Aaron leaned down to whisper, "You were incredible." "So were you," she replied, her voice barely audible over the noise. For the first time, she saw something new in his eyes. Not arrogance, but humility. The press conference ended, but the work was just beginning. Over the next several days, Aaron and Amara threw themselves into meetings and interviews, working late into the night to turn their plans into reality. Despite the exhaustion, Amara found herself drawn to Aaron in ways she hadn't anticipated. Beneath the hardened exterior, he was a man desperately trying to redeem himself, not just for Cassidy, but for the man he used to be. And Aaron found himself relying on Amara more than he thought possible. Her strength grounded him, her vision gave him purpose, and her compassion reminded him of the kind of man he wanted to be. One night, as they reviewed documents in the hospital cafeteria, Aaron set his pen down and looked at Amara. "I meant what I said back there," he said softly. "You're the heart of this foundation." Amara shook her head. "We built this together." Aaron reached across the table, taking her hand. "Then let's keep building it," he said. "Not just for the kids, for us. The words hung between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the hospital courtyard. Rows of folding chairs lined the trimmed grass, and the air buzzed with the quiet hum of conversation. Families, hospital staff, donors, and local officials filled the seats, all gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the new pediatric care wing funded by the Blake Jones Foundation. Aaron stood near the edge of the crowd, his suit jacket hanging loosely over his shoulders as he watched Cassidy twirl in her dress near the front row. She looked healthier now, her cheeks flushed with color and her laughter echoing above the murmurs of the crowd. Seeing her like this, a vibrant, carefree child, filled him with equal parts relief and resolve. It had been months since that fateful night in the emergency room, but the weight of it still lingered in his chest. It wasn't a burden anymore, though. It was fuel. Amara stood a few feet away, talking quietly with one of the doctors. She wore a light blue dress instead of her scrubs, and Aaron found himself momentarily distracted by how different she looked outside the clinical setting. Confident, radiant, and, for the first time, relaxed. She caught his eye and gave him a small smile, one that sent warmth spreading through his chest. The past few months had changed them both. When the applause quieted and the crowd turned their attention to the stage, Aaron stepped to the podium. The microphones buzzed softly as he adjusted them, scanning the faces in the audience. 6 months ago, he began, his voice steady, I walked through the doors of this hospital terrified. My daughter was fighting for her life, and for the first time in my life, I had no control, no answers, and no idea what to do. He paused, letting the memory of that night settle in the air. What I found here wasn't just medical expertise. I found compassion, dedication, and most of all, hope. He glanced at Amara, whose eyes met his with quiet encouragement. One person in particular taught me what it means to care, not just in words, but in actions. He nodded toward Amara, and the crowd followed his gaze. Nurse Amara Jones saved my daughter's life. Twice. And in doing so, she opened my eyes to something I'd been blind to for too long. Aaron stepped away from the podium, pacing slightly as he continued. For years, I measured my success by the size of my company and the numbers in my bank account. I thought power meant never showing weakness, never needing anyone. He stopped, looking directly at the crowd. But I was wrong. Real strength isn't about how much you can take. It's about how much you can give. The audience stirred, and Aaron let the words settle before continuing. That's why today isn't just about opening a new wing of this hospital. It's about starting something bigger. A foundation built on the belief that every child deserves a chance, regardless of where they come from or how much money their family has. He turned to look at Amara again. And it's about honoring the people who dedicate their lives to giving those kids that chance. The crowd erupted in applause, and Aaron stepped back from the podium, gesturing for Amara to join him. She hesitated for only a moment before walking to his side. When the noise quieted, she spoke, her voice strong despite the emotion in her eyes. This foundation isn't just a project for me, she said. It's personal. It's about the parents who sit in waiting rooms holding their breath. It's about the kids who fight battles they shouldn't have to face alone. And it's about the nurses and doctors who give everything they have, day after day. She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. We started this because one night, 2 families faced the unthinkable. But this is about so much more than that. It's about hope. And it's about proving that no matter where you come from, you can make a difference. The applause rose again, but this time it was mixed with cheers and whistles. Amara turned to Aaron as he handed her a pair of oversized scissors for the ribbon cutting. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Amara smiled. More than ready. Together, they cut the ribbon, and the crowd erupted. The reception that followed was a blur of handshakes, photos, and conversations, but Aaron's focus never drifted far from Amara. Later, when the crowd began to thin, he found her standing near the edge of the courtyard, staring out at the sunset. "Not bad for a first event," he said, stepping beside her. Amara chuckled softly. "Not bad at all." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sky shift from gold to deep orange. "I meant what I said earlier," Aaron said quietly. "This wouldn't have happened without you." Amara turned to him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "You give me too much credit." "No," Aaron said firmly, "not enough." Their eyes met, and for a moment the noise of the world seemed to fade away. "I never thought I'd say this," Aaron continued, "but that night, the one I thought was the worst of my life, changed everything. Not just for Cassidy, for me." Amara swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Me too." Aaron reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "What happens now?" Amara asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Aaron squeezed her hand. "We keep building this, together." Amara smiled, and for the first time in a long time, Aaron felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Cassidy ran up to them a moment later, her dress swishing around her legs. "Dad, come see. They have a playroom with toys and books." Aaron laughed, releasing Amara's hand to scoop his daughter up. "I'll be right there." As Cassidy darted back toward the building, Aaron turned to Amara. "Ready for whatever comes next?" Amara smiled. "With you, always." If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new releases. Watch other videos with exciting stories and share this story with your friends. Thanks for watching.